Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakuki.
When I am doing the things that I'm doing, I'm representing my past, I'm representing my ancestors, and all the people here today who helped me be who I am. We know who we are. We know what our ancestors say. We know what our people have been doing in terms of science for millennia. I feel this beautiful sense of responsibility to perpetuate that. We want to make sure that our children and our children's children keep knowing what that looks like.
See and share our stories at togetherwe'remore.com.
For generations, Native American communities have endured the devastating loss of their spiritual and religious practices at the hands of forced assimilation. Ceremonies, languages, and sacred traditions that connected them deeply to the land, their ancestors, and the Creator were outlawed, suppressed, and violently erased. Boarding schools, federal policies, and missionary efforts all worked to dismantle these spiritual lifeways, leaving many tribes to practice their beliefs in secret or risk punishment. A tragic example of this oppression is the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, when hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children were killed by U.S. soldiers for practicing the ghost dance, a spiritual ceremony meant to restore their way of life. This tragedy actually occurred due to a misunderstanding of the purpose of the dance, or perhaps it was an excuse for an example to be made of American Indian people who refused to assimilate. You see, as the U.S. government pushed deeper into Native territories, the Lakota people were steadily losing their land and witnessing the destruction of their way of life. Their primary food source, the buffalo, was being driven to near extinction. Promised rations often never arrived, and waves of disease swept through their communities. By 1889 and 1890, death from starvation and illness was rising at alarming rates, and morale among the Lakota of Standing Rock was crumbling under the weight of relentless hardship and broken promises. At the time, Sitting Bull was a powerful Lakota leader, and he worried about the future of his people. The following are excerpts from NorthDakotaStudies.gov. In the spring of 1890, the people of Standing Rock learned of a new religion. The ghost dance, as it was called, had started in Nevada, but was spreading to Indian tribes all over the West. In October 1890, Sitting Bull invited Kicking Bear, an Oglala Lakota from the Pine Ridge Reservation, to come to Standing Rock to teach the ghost dance to the Hunkpapas. The Lakotas welcomed the hope and inspiration the religion brought to them. However, non Indians living near reservations became fearful about the new religion, which promised that the buffalo would return and that Indian peoples would once again become powerful. Non Indians did not understand that the ghost dance was a peaceful religion, nor did they understand how important it was for the Lakotas to hope for a better future. Non Indians often called the ghost dance the Messiah craze. President Benjamin Harrison asked the Army to investigate the ghost dance at Standing Rock. Major James McLaughlin, the agent at Standing Rock, agreed that if Sitting Bull were not on the reservation, the people would no longer follow the ghost dance. Red Tomahawk was a sergeant of Indian police. On December 15, 1890, as Sitting Bull was arrested and taken from his cabin, Red Tomahawk walked behind the great leader. After Sitting Bull was shot in the side, Red Tomahawk shot him in the back of the head. The great, wise, and holy man of the Hunkpapas died. On the day Sitting Bull died, Another respected spiritual leader named Bigfoot started on a journey to help bring peace to the people of Pine Ridge. He traveled with a group of about 350 people, including a few who had fled Sitting Bull's camp. General Miles ordered soldiers to arrest Bigfoot. For almost 2 weeks, Bigfoot's band continued on, avoiding the army. They did not understand why the army was after them. The soldiers mistakenly believed that Bigfoot might cause problems at Pine Ridge. Finally, the army stopped them and escorted them to a place on the Pine Ridge Reservation called Wounded Knee Creek. On December 29th, 1890, the army attempted to take weapons from them. A few resisted being disarmed. A shot was fired by a person unknown to us. Soldiers then opened fire. At least 150 Minneconjou men, women, and children died. Some historians say perhaps as many as 300 were killed or wounded, including Bigfoot. 25 soldiers died and 39 were wounded. The massacre at Wounded Knee was the last armed encounter between the Lakotas and the U.S. Army. In 1978 to 88, years after the Wounded Knee Massacre, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted. What did this act mean for our American Indian people? Today, we'll learn the answer to this question and much more. I'd like to introduce you to my guest, Professor Richard W. Garnett, who happens to be Choctaw and who comes to us today from Notre Dame Law. Professor Garnett, welcome to Native Choctaw.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, listeners, it's truly an honor to have with us today someone who can shed light on so many questions about American Indian religious rights, questions I've carried for a long time, and I know many of you have too. So let's take a moment to learn more about our esteemed guest with this introduction from the Notre Dame website, which reads, Professor Richard W. Garnett teaches and writes in the areas of constitutional law, criminal law, the First Amendment, and law and religion. He is a leading authority on questions and debates regarding religious freedom and church state relations, and is the founding director of Notre Dame Law School's program on church, state, and society. Garnett clerked for the late Chief Justice of the United States, William H. Rehnquist, and also for the late Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit, Richard S. Arnold. He earned his JD from Yale Law School in 1995 and his BA summa cum laude from Duke University in 1990. He joined the facility in 1999 after practicing law in Washington, D.C. with Miller, Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin. I'll also add that he has taught the following courses again, constitutional law and criminal law, freedom of religion, the death penalty, freedom of speech, constitutional criminal procedure, modern constitutional theory, and Catholic social thought. Now, Professor Garnett, you and I have a mutual acquaintance. Alexandria Noble Steinbrecher is my daughter, and she's going into her third year of law school there at Notre Dame. And she's the president of the Native American Law Students Association, or NALSA, there at Notre Dame. And since you run NALSA, why don't you tell us more about the association?
Well, it's your daughter who runs it. I'm just the faculty advisor. She has to do all the work. I'm
Right.
I'm honored to be a resource whenever she or other students need it. But yeah, so NALSA is one of our student affinity groups. Um, it plays a number of roles because a lot of people don't know about some of the intricacies of how federal law interacts with Native American tribes, how federal law and state law interact when it comes to dealing with tribal matters. A lot of what NALSA does is really kind of assist the law school faculty educating students about this very complicated,
Oh.
very important area of law. So it also has a couple layers, like on the one hand, it's a group of students who have this shared kind of affinity, ethnicity, identity, but it's also, I think, has an academic component where, again, I know I just said this, but the area is called Federal Indian Law is the name that's given to it, and it's complicated, it's fascinating, it's rich, And Notre Dame for years has had some of the really the world's leading experts on federal Indian law. And I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about my former colleague Nell Newton, who
Oh,
was,
really?
yeah, she was a very important Indian law scholar. She's, authored like the book on the subject. So Notre Dame has been a place for a long time that has had kind of a connection with this subject matter. And I have to say, I'm not saying this just because it's your show, but Alex has done a great job of kind of invigorating things. We don't
Oh,
have that many students who participate in NALSA. It varies from year to year, and a lot of the group's success depends on the energy of the students. And Alex has been a real blessing for us. So thanks for sharing it with us.
that's amazing. And I promise you, listeners, I did not slip him a 20 to say that. I really appreciate you saying that, though, because she was so excited when she realized there was a Native American in law group there. And so thank you for mentoring her and for even thank you to Notre Dame for having that program. And it sounds like there aren't a lot of Native Americans in law school there, specifically at Notre Dame, correct?
Yeah, I mean, Native Americans are underrepresented in legal education generally.
Okay.
There are some schools where the numbers are higher, schools like Arizona State, University of Arizona, um, Hamlin Mitchell up in Minnesota has a pretty vast population. At Notre Dame, we tend to have relatively few.
So, if there are Native Americans looking to attend law school, what about Notre Dame is especially enticing to those prospective Native students?
Yeah, well, a couple things, and it's nice of you to give me the chance to put in a plug for Notre Dame, which is an institution I care very much about.
Absolutely.
We have a really interesting history in this respect. A long time ago, in the early 19th century, 1820s and 30s and so on, the Native Americans who were in this area, northern Indiana, uh, our particular area was the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomis. There have been other groups in this area for centuries, obviously, as well, Ojibways and so on, Miamis. But
Mhm.
the particular group of the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomis, and I can't resist, I live on a street called Pokagon Street, which is kind
Do
of
you
funny.
really?
They invited uh, the local, and by local, I mean some guy who was hundreds of miles away, the local bishop to send some priests to the area to help teach kids. Um, the Pokagon band had become, a lot of them had become Catholic relatively early on. So a priest named Father Baden came to this area, which there'd been a little settlement here for a long time. By here, I mean what's now South Bend.
Hmm.
Uh, and he came and there was famously built a log chapel and there was sort of a little school in place and so on. But eventually, that little log cabin became, once the priests from this order called the Congregation of Holy Cross, who were French, came up here and started a school which they called Our Lady of the Lake, Notre Dame du Lac. Um, and so from the very beginning, there was a very close partnership between the priests who founded Notre Dame, the institution itself, and the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi. And they collaborated for decades. So after the Treaty of Chicago, again back in the 19th century, which resulted in, the euphemism, I guess, is the removal, but the
Hmm.
forced expulsion of a lot of the Potawatomi from this area further west. The Pokagon band, a lot of them were permitted to stay because of their connection with and the advocacy of the University of Notre Dame. And today, the Pokagon band here in this area is really thriving economically. They're behind a lot of economic development, um, and I think the relationship is still a healthy one. So, if for those, especially those of us, who are interested in these historical matters, if there are law students who want to be at an institution that has this kind of close history of collaboration, I think we're a good spot for that.
I think so too. And, you went to Yale Law School, and my
I did.
daughter did her undergrad at Yale. And It's a great school. It's amazing, but she really has found her niche at Notre Dame, because the professors, and same at Yale, just different vibe. You know, it's the Midwest. I think there's some hospitality out there in Indiana, and she really, I don't even know how to describe how happy she is. I mentioned to you earlier today, she's in her internship right now in Indianapolis and at a law firm. And Notre Dame has set her up so well to succeed, with professors who have really cared. And she's getting that a lot more at Notre Dame than just anywhere else she's been. And so I really appreciate that about law school. So I will also put my personal 2 cents in there, that if you are native, check out Notre Dame. And if you're going into law, please check out Notre Dame Law, because it is definitely a place where you will feel at home and taken care of. So, and you're definitely going to learn a lot and be set up for success.
Yeah. Well, can I add one more thing? And again,
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Warms my heart to know that Alex has had such a good experience. Another thing about our university that I think would make this place a good fit is that we have a real specialty throughout the university in kind of global human rights, which obviously
Mm,
touches upon so many issues of concern
yes.
indigenous peoples around the world. So I think for students who have a particular interest in those matters, and again, not just for Native Americans, but for indigenous folks everywhere, this is a place where there's a lot of expertise.
Absolutely. I always wondered, when you met Alexandria, were you surprised there was a Choctaw in the law school? I mean, I assume there aren't many Choctaws in South Bend, Indiana in general, right?
Yeah, so I was, I mean, maybe surprised isn't quite what I was thinking, but I was totally psyched. It was great. It was fun to have that
Yeah.
connection. And like I think I mentioned earlier, some years there's more energy and then all of a sudden some years there's not. And once I found out that Alex and I had this shared connection, I had a good feeling that the group would be in good hands, and so I was delighted.
Oh, absolutely. So the event I mentioned earlier, the Wounded Knee Massacre, was a devastating travesty built on a misunderstanding that could have been avoided. Rachel Treisman, who in 2023 wrote an article on NPR.org, recalled on February 27th, 1973, some 200 members of the Oglala Lakota tribe, led by members of American Indian Movement, or AIM, occupied the Pine Ridge Reservation Village, which was also the site of the 1890 massacre. As most folks know, the situation escalated into an armed standoff. The article goes on to say Kevin McKiernan, who made a documentary called From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, A Reporter's Journey, says there were other gains from the occupation, like legislation such as the Indian Freedom of Religion Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Something Kevin said that I found interesting was, if you're Catholic, you don't need a congressional act to pray. If you're Jewish, or if you go to a temple, or if you're Muslim, you don't need a congressional act, because your religion is not prescribed. But theirs was, meaning the Native Americans, they had to have a congressional act to practice their religion, in other words. Considering your background in all things religious freedom, what are your thoughts on that statement from Kevin McKiernan?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, let's backtrack in time a little bit. I mean, the United States Constitution guarantees the free exercise of religion, and it guarantees it to everyone, including Native Americans. That promise was not, as you know, always honored, to put
Mhm.
it mildly. But I guess it's worth saying that the constitutional right to the free exercise of religion existed before the act that you're talking about. But what that act did, I think, was it kind of reminded people that Native Americans were shared beneficiaries of this constitutional promise. It reminded people that the freedom of religion belongs not only to Protestant Christians, who were the majority and whose practices
Yeah.
people were familiar with, but it belonged to other people who practice religions that might have looked different to the majority, whether that's immigrants who are Buddhists or Muslims, or indigenous peoples who had various forms of traditional religious practice that didn't necessarily look like Protestant Christianity. So I think it's worth remembering that the guarantee was supposed to be there from the beginning, at least from the time that Congress made all Native Americans citizens of the United States. But it took a long time, and we're still working on it, to good on that promise. And I think a really
Hmm.
important step, what were some of the pieces of legislation that you just mentioned. I'd add one more that it wasn't quoted in the excerpt you mentioned, but the Indian Civil Rights Act did an important thing where it said that the Bill of Rights was going to apply to tribal governments. Now, on the one hand, that might look like it's limiting tribal governments because it's telling them, look, you have to follow these rules. But one of the really interesting things that act did was it said that tribal governments are not limited by the federal establishment clause. Now, forgive me if I get a little geeky here, but the
No, let's do it.
the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which a lot of your listeners are familiar with, I'm sure, is like we're not
Mhm.
allowed to have a national religion in the United States, and we're not allowed to have state religions. Oklahoma can't declare itself a Baptist state.
Right.
Rhode Island can't declare itself a Catholic state. But interestingly, at the same time that Congress told the Native American tribes, which are sovereigns in at least to an extent in our country, that they had to follow certain protections, like they couldn't rule an unusual punishment and things like that.
Mhm.
It said they're not bound by the Establishment Clause. So in that law, Congress actually recognized that tribal governments should have the ability to kind of affirm and embrace and promote their tribal religions if they so choose. So you have an interesting dynamic where, in a sense, state governments have to be secular. Tribal governments, if they choose not to be, they don't necessarily have to be, which is an interesting feature of our law.
Something I never even knew.
Yeah.
Okay, listeners, did you take that in? I think that is absolutely fascinating. Is part of this challenge with freedom of religion what constitutes religion? Um, so in that case, is smoking peyote and going into a tent and seeing visions, is that religion? And it
Yeah.
sounds like for the Native Americans, they have that right to decide that that is technically under the banner of religion. Is that correct?
Well, so it is, but again, going back to what you were talking about before, I think it's fair to say that for a long time, our law had kind of a blind spot. People who were enforcing our laws or judges, they had a certain idea about what religious practice
Yeah.
looked like. You know what I mean?
Right.
Looked like the stuff we're familiar with. And I think one of the things that these more recent acts, like the one you mentioned, kind of brought to our consciousness was a reminder that a lot of times religious practice looks different than what we're familiar with. So it can include things like sweat lodge practices or, the famous ghost dance from the late 19th century, sweat lodges, other things. And of course, as you and I know, many Native Americans also practice standard issue American Protestant Christianity or Catholic Christianity and so on. So there's all kinds of different ways that Native Americans practice their religions. But I think now courts are more sensitive. I think a lot of people would say they're still not totally sensitive, but they're more sensitive than they were 50 years ago to the fact that religious practice can look different. And in particular, Native American religious practice, traditional indigenous Native American religious practice can look different. If I had to put that difference in a nutshell, and I think this is part of what the challenge was for judges for many decades, is that uh, for a long time, the majority of Americans thought about religion in terms of belief. It's what you believe. It's your
Mhm.
creed. It's your prayers. It's what's in your head. And I think there's always been a dimension, or there long was a dimension of Native American religious practices that were not only about belief or a creed, but about place and about connections with the physical. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Uh, with the land, with particular places, with sacred spaces. You know, for if you're a standard issue American Protestant Christian, you're not necessarily, you might have places that are very special to you, or if you're Roman Catholic like I am, there are places that are very special to you.
Right.
But generally speaking, you can take your religion wherever you want to go. But for a lot of indigenous peoples, the actual real spaces themselves were, this is a buzzword, but were sacral. And I
Yeah.
think more appreciation for that in the law now than there once was. Although, as we're going
Hmm.
to talk about, there's still some fights going on about indigenous
Yes.
sacred lands. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you look at Mount Rushmore. Those are sacred lands, and then what do you do? And this is a hypothetical, but what do you do in the case when Native Americans come back and say, these are the lands of our ancestors. They've been sacred to us for many years, but it's already been way colonized and there are businesses there, there are people living there. I don't know that there is a perfect answer in all of those cases. We hear land back quite a bit. It can get very controversial. But yet if they deem it sacred, does that take precedence over what's already happened? And again, I don't have an answer to that. I don't know if you do either, but
Well, I mean, I could tell you a bit about what the law is, and you cut me off whenever you want. But so in the American law of religious freedom, your typical case, the one that courts are most comfortable with,
yeah,
is, there's somebody who wants to practice their religion in a certain way, and a government regulation limits their ability to do that. So think back to prohibition, in the early part of the 20th century. Um, in theory, the consumption of alcoholic beverages is outlawed. But there's a lot of religious folks who need to consume alcohol in the course of some of their rituals. Again, I'm a
right,
Catholic. We use wine,
right.
but you can see a very square conflict. Or a lot of our cases in the middle of the 20th century involve the Jehovah's Witnesses. The
Okay.
Jehovah's Witnesses, they do not, they have a very strong view about idolatry, so that they couldn't salute the flag. So you had all these cases about, kids who refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance. But there was a rule that said you had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. You
Hmm.
mentioned earlier peyote. Peyote, it was scheduled as an unlawful drug. It was unlawful to use peyote. So in theory, even if you were motivated to use peyote because of your religion, even if you were using it as part of a religious ceremony, the government can regulate that. Now, we've had a lot of cases working this through, and I'm happy to go into more detail if you want. But for now, I just want listeners to see that um, some of these conflicts are very easy to get your head around. Regulation, religious practice, they're in conflict. Okay.
Yeah.
Harder cases are the ones that you mentioned, where, again, this conversation we're having about sacred spaces and lands. What if, for all kinds of complicated reasons having to do with expansion and colonization and so on, that there's a sacred spot, but it's government property.
Right.
And government, generally speaking, is allowed to do what it wants to with its own land. That's, pretty standard. If the government has a national forest, it can decide whether it wants to, give a lease to some grazing or some farmers, or more often it's mining, can be an issue. Um, is it part of the freedom of religion to be able to tell the government, you can't use your land that way because even though it's your land, it is special to me, it is special to us? That's an issue the court has had a really tough time
I
dealing.
bet.
Well, spoiler alert, the courts have tended to say, no, you don't
Yeah.
have a right to tell the government how it's going to use its own land. Um, there are some cases going on in the courts right now, like as we speak, dealing with this issue. But a famous case was called Lynn, about 40 years ago, and it involved, the construction of a road that was going to go through some land that was going to intrude upon some sacred space and was going to interfere with some Native American religious practices. And the court, in reasoning that a lot of scholars find problematic, said it doesn't count as a burden on your religious freedom when the government uses its own land. That doesn't count, because
Huh.
you're still allowed to believe whatever you want. So the court thought, but again, kind of missing the point that it's not just about belief. So this is
Oh,
something. If I had to think of the most challenging issue in American religious freedom law right now, it is how to deal with the claims about sacred lands when they happen to be on public land, or when you have
Yes.
general regulations about land use that are interfering with or bumping up against the uses that Native Americans want to use for religious reasons.
It really is a conundrum and again, a controversial one. So I'll leave it at that, but that is very interesting.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.